In this video, we're going to discuss the final step of using SPSS for analysis, and that is extracting the results from SPSS and using them in a report. The kind of elephant in the room when using SPSS for analysis, and really any statistical software, is that typically the default output from the software is not of the quality to be put into a report verbatim. You actually have to do quite a bit of formatting for that to be put into a report. The other thing is that SPSS, like many other statistical softwares, often gives you a lot of tables, graphics, reports, and statistics that really you don't need within your write-up. What you need within your write-up is a bit complex and touchy and as much an art as a science, but as a rule, you don't need everything. My rule of thumb is if I talk about it in text or refer to it, that should be in my write-up, and if I don't talk about it in text or refer to it, it shouldn't. To learn what you should and shouldn't talk about in text, I advise reading target journals or other reports of a similar analysis to identify what other people are talking about in text and reporting. But again, it's not going to be everything, nor should it. Typically, it'll be a table or two, or maybe a graphic or two. To demonstrate kind of how we go through this, I'm going to do a ANOVA analysis and ANOVA. So I'll go to compare means, one-way ANOVA, and I'll analyze our positive scale score using our source as the factor. I'll go on and estimate effect sizes and click OK to run this particular analysis. Now here we can see we have our ANOVA and we can see we have our effect size with the lower and upper confidence intervals. What I'm going to do to get myself started is to copy and paste these values into Word, but understand I'm actually going to delete most of this information. Now, when I'm copying and pasting things, I'm going to plan on using ANOVA and the ANOVA effect size in my final report. That's why I'm including both of these. But things I wouldn't copy and paste are things like this, because I'm not going to be using this in my report. If there were other statistics or analyses or tables, you'll note, did not select those because I knew I wasn't going to copy those into my report. But if I had selected those and those weren't things that I discuss in my writing, those would be things that I would not include. To copy and paste, I'll select a table, right-click, and select Copy, and then open my Word document, right-click, and select Paste. There's a variety of different paste options. I'll just go with the standard Control-V, my default. Now, how do I know what an ANOVA table should look like within the context in which I'm trying to publish? Well, that's a really good question. I would read, again, example articles if it's a journal you're trying to publish in. If it's a conference, I'd look at previous presentations at that conference. And if it's a dissertation, I'd see if you have access to any other dissertations or discuss it with a committee member or a chair to understand the format with which you're supposed to follow. If you're using APA format or MLA, these style guides often also have example tables, statistical tables that you can follow the formatting of. For me, I just pulled one offline, and we'll say that this is my target, where I have the predictor, the sums of squares, the degrees of freedom, mean squared, F, and the p-value, as well as the effect size and the confidence interval of the effect size listed afterwards. And you'll see I'm going to be using my ANOVA table, but I'm also going to be using my effect size. So I'm going to go on and copy and paste my effect size in. Now we can tell right off the bat, I'm not going to keep most of this table. In fact, most of this is going to be deleted. And within my target formatting, I really only want to keep the effect size, one of the effect size measures, and it's not going to be its own table. It's going to be part of the main table. So I have a ton of work to do to get these particular tables to collapse down into a single table and to match the target formatting that I'm going after. These right now aren't really anywhere close. A couple of things to note about the formatting. One of the things of the formatting is just where the lines are, what the text looks like, what the colors look like. But the other thing in formatting to note is things like decimal places, etc. So I can see that in this report, the statistics all go out to 2 decimal places, the p-value goes out to 3 decimal places, and the effect size goes out to 2 decimal places. And this is not the case within my current report, so it's something that I'm going to have to edit. Of course, with this, if I went out to only 2 decimal places with my effect size, that would just be 0. So here I might deviate from my style guide, keeping these out to 3 decimal places, and most style guides suggest that if you need 3 decimal places to represent the meaningful digits within the number that you're reporting, you stick with whatever number of decimal places you need. All right, so to create this table, we have 2 main options that we can follow. The first option is that I can do a table where I edit the previous table that's been reported by SPSS. So I would take this table and start to play around with and edit this table in order to make it look like the one below. So that's one option. A second option is I could create an entirely new table in Word and start to put these values into that new table. Though each option in different settings may have different strengths and benefits, I think for this and how I'm going to demonstrate it in this video, I'm going to go on and make a blank table that kind of mimics what I'm going after, my target, and then import the values into a blank table. That is, I'm actually going to end up deleting both of these SPSS tables because both of these are just going to be too difficult to format correctly to even bother keeping. It's easier to make a whole new table and then copy and paste. So how do I start by doing this? Well, first I have to see what I'm going to end up reporting because my example isn't necessarily the exact same thing as what I have. First of all, I note that there's no total column in my example and that this was a regression example that I looked at, so I need to not include the intercept column either. Ultimately, I'm just going to have between groups and within groups, and I'm going to need to change that to be my independent variable and error to follow the style guide. So I'm going to have 2 rows and 1 series of columns here. And I'll go on and create something that has 3 total rows, 1 for my column names, and then 1 for my between and 1 for my within. And let's see how many columns I need. I need the predictor, sum of squares, degrees of freedom, mean square, F, P, effect size, confidence interval. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I need 3 rows and 8 columns. Fantastic. So my insert table tool is handy. If I needed to insert something with a different number of things, I could do insert table. And I'm going to go on and start off by just copying the header information as best I can. Now, I don't have access to the partial eta squared effect size. I just have eta squared. So over here, instead of partial eta squared, I'm just going to include eta squared with a 90% confidence interval. And then for mine, I have a 95% confidence interval. I could go back into SPSS and change that confidence interval to be 90%. I'm not going to worry about doing that. And I'll follow my naming. This says eta squared, 90% CI. So eta squared, 90% CI. All right. So I've got those headers. Now I'm going to add in these headers: predictor, sum of squares, degrees of freedom, mean squared, F, and P. You'll note that I could add and copy some of this from up here, but frankly, all of this is in different text colors and stuff, and I really don't even want to touch that. So frankly, it really is going to be quicker to just type it in: predictor, sum of squares, degrees of freedom, mean squared, FP. Now I'm going to follow the naming conventions. Degrees of freedom, F and P are all italicized. DF and P are lowercase. And looking down here, all of these appear to be centered. So I'm going to go on and center all of this by highlighting it, going to Layout, and selecting Center. Fantastic. Oh, and they are centered vertically too. So I need to highlight this whole row, go to layout, and select vertically center too. Fantastic. Ooh, having fun yet? Again, this is such kind of a weird thing to include in an SPSS class, but frankly, I find it so important because I feel like we never teach this anywhere else, and it's really just a big deal to be able to understand that this is not enough. If you turn this in, you fail your dissertation. I'm not going to sign off on this. Nobody's going to sign off on this, and you're not going to get published with this. What you really need to do is be able to follow the formatting guide of whatever you're doing and learn how to, and this is the time where we're doing that. Well, here's one of the cool things that we can do with the predictor. Again, I need to rename this within my context of the SPSS. My predictor was the, let's see, so my outcome was the scale score. What was my predictor in my analysis? I believe my predictor was the country, right? I can go back to analyze and compare means. See, this is how old I'm getting. Source. So my predictor was the source. So I'll write source here. And then the second thing, instead of being called within groups, this formatting calls it error. And as you've no doubt seen in your statistics class, we have between within, but we also have factor and error. So this is just another way of expressing within groups. And it really just depends on the format in which I'm for the journal that I'm targeting. All right, well, here I can go on and just retype all this information in, but actually there was a reason why I exported this from SPSS, and that is I can copy, so I'm going to highlight the cells, not the between within groups, but all the cells of numbers. I'm going to hit Control C, and then down here I'm going to hit Control V to copy and paste those numbers over into my table. So actually this saves me a fair amount of time by filling in these values. Now I do have to edit them a little bit to make sure that they're following the same font. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select on a value that I've typed in. I'm going to go to Home and Format Painter and click this. And then I'm going to highlight all the information that I just copied in, and this is going to apply this format to all of the data. Fantastic. Well, I'm getting pretty close. I just need my eta squared and eta 90% confidence interval, and then to go in and clean up some decimals, and then I'm there. So for my eta squared, I can copy and paste this over, but again, I'd have to use the format painter. It might be easier to just type it in by hand. And then for the confidence interval, looks like it's within brackets. I'm again going to go on and just type that in by hand because that'll be easier than 0.004 than copying and pasting. All right, so I have the data in. Looks like all of this needs to be right aligned instead of left aligned. So I'm going to go in and do that, highlight all of my values, go to Layout, right align them, because that's what my example does. It puts all of them on the right. And let's see what we have to do. Well, there's a lot of lines in this table that I have to get rid of, and I've got to take care of some of the details in this decimals, but I'm actually getting kind of close. So let's go on and do that. Maybe I'll start with the decimals because that sounds a little bit easier. So down here, again, everything's listed in 2 decimals except the degrees of freedom, which doesn't have any decimals, and the p-value, which goes out to 3. So for me, I'll include the, go to 2 decimals, 0.32. I'm rounding appropriately, 9.4, and 4.5, rounding appropriately, and 8.5, rounding appropriately. And everything else goes down to 2. Perfect. I actually noted down here that my degrees of freedom are center aligned for some reason. So I'm going to go on and center align to match my formatting guide that I'm aiming for. And now my decimals are all appropriate through my table. Last but not least, I'm going to have to add in the correct borders. So it looks like I have a line on top of my label, a line below my labels, and then a line on the very bottom of my table. And this is a very common format for tables. So what I'm going to do for my labels is I'm going to click on the top left of my table to select everything in the table. Go to Design, go to Borders, and then select No Border to erase all of the borders on my table. So that gets rid of everything real quick, and it kind of looks a little bit naked. Now I'm going to slide my cursor off to the left of the top row, go back to borders, and then add both a bottom and a top border to make it look like the top row in my example. Finally, I'm going to drag my cursor over to the left of the bottom row and add a bottom border to, again, make this look like my sample. And this is the way that I've created a formatted table using my SPSS output. Again, you'll note in my final report, I'm not including my original ANOVA table. I'm going to go on and delete this table. I'm not including my effect size table. I'm including the information from all of that, but I'm including it in a formatted table that is formatted after the target style of whatever I'm aiming for. In this particular case, it was just a random image I found online when I Googled ANOVA table. Here, if I wanted to add a table title, I do the table number. I might add in italics this ANOVA of source on positive scale for a label for my table. And this could be considered an APA styled table. Of course, we might have to, I don't know, put it in 12-point font. We might have to put it in Times New Roman. There might be some other things we have to do depending on our style guide, but this looks like a nicely formatted table and certainly not something that's just been copied and pasted straight out of SPSS. All right, this has been a video in a bit of a different direction for an SPSS class, but focusing on what for me is actually a really important part of using SPSS for analysis, and that is exporting the SPSS results into a formatted table that can be included in a report. Within this, we've discussed how we can copy and paste SPSS output into Word, how we can use a template from, say, a target journal, target report, or an example provided to us from any other source to create a new table that includes our information but is formatted after that target. Of a couple of different options that we had, we could have edited the SPSS table. In this video, we demonstrated how we could make a new table but still save ourselves some work by copying and pasting information from the SPSS table into the table that we created. Finally, we applied a few polishing details and discussed how we certainly aren't going to include all of the SPSS output. In fact, in this particular example, we included no SPSS output other than what was copied and pasted into the table that we created in Word.